The War for Independence was a significant turning point for both America and the Presbyterian Church. Prior to and during the American Revolution, colonists of the 1770s debated and discussed whether it was proper to defend their rights and freedoms by going to war with Britain. The Bible was often at the center of colonists' discussions, sermons, and political writings regarding revolution. The Bible and Calvinism had an incredibly strong influence on the American Revolution. A loyalist friend of Lord Dartmouth, a member of the British Parliament, wrote from New York in 1776 that Presbyterianism is really at the bottom of the whole conspiracy, has supplied it with vigor, and will never rest till something is decided upon it. While patriot colonists in the 13 colonies comprised many different religious sects, a focus on Calvinist ideals of political resistance and popular sovereignty led some loyalists to refer to the war as the Presbyterian Rebellion. Now, I must say the term Presbyterian was broadly used to refer to all Calvinists, including New England Puritans. Presbyterian support for independence was not totally monolithic. There were patriot, loyalist, and neutral Presbyterians. But the majority of Presbyterians were, by the time of the war, of Scots-Irish origin, and they almost totally supported the patriot side. The Scots-Irish had little loyalty and often downright hostility to the Crown of England. They brought with them from Northern Ireland terrible memories of religious bigotry and injustice, of persecution at the hands of the English governing class. They came armed with the teachings of John Calvin, filtered through John Knox, and solidified during the English Civil War. Calvinism was a theology which believed in the absolute sovereignty of God. God alone is Lord of all and the author of liberty. There was also a belief in the absolute equality of individuals. King and peasant, clergy and laity were equal under God's law. In addition, there was the belief that no human being should be entrusted with absolute power, given our radically fallen human nature. And because of their experience as nonconformists in an Anglican Ulster, they brought the belief that religious freedom should be respected. Freedom of conscience was vital to their theology, a theology that shaped the understanding of civil liberty which led to the War of Independence. The Scots-Irish and the First Frontier. The arrival of what has been estimated were between 250,000 and 450,000 Ulster Scots from Northern Ireland to the American colonies is often called the Great Migration. They outnumbered all other immigrant groups at the time. The Scots-Irish came to America as indentured servants and free people, individuals and families, and sometimes as political exiles, refugees, and convicted criminals. The Great Migration began in 1717. It would continue in successive waves for the next 58 years. Reverend Jonathan Dickinson reported from Philadelphia in 1717 that We have had 12 or 13 sail of ships from the north of Ireland with a swarm of people. The people who began to come to America in 1717 were not Scots, and certainly they were not Irish. Already they were Scots-Irish, even though the name was rarely used by them. The hyphen bespeaks 2 centuries of historical events, many of them tragic. Dark and droobly was the Scottish phrase. 5 great waves of Ulster Scots came to America, depressed the economy of Ulster, and depopulated parts of that province. The major flow of newcomers landed in Pennsylvania. That sea route was driven by the important trade that linked the port of Philadelphia with Ulster ports. After unloading their American cargoes in Ulster, particularly flax seeds for the linen industry, ship captains filled their vessels with emigrants for the return trip. As more and more Ulster people traveled to America, encouraging tales of its widespread opportunities flowed back to Ulster. In each wave, other colonies also drew settlers. Because the Delaware River ports early proved the favorite entranceway to the colonies, many went to New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. Some even went up to Massachusetts, where they were reluctantly admitted, but grew so disliked for their uncongenial ways by the Puritans that later arrivals in Boston were sent promptly to New Hampshire or Maine. Still, most came through or stayed in Pennsylvania. It was largely because of one man. His name was James Logan, 1674 to 1751. He was almost unique by being an Ulster Scots Quaker. He was William Penn's secretary and land agent. As the years progressed, it became clear to Logan that Penn's dream of forming a colony with strict pacifist principles was rather naive and doomed to failure in this wild frontier. Native Americans were threatening many settlements which had encroached on their land. Yet the pacifist Quakers who controlled the colony's affairs could not bring themselves to raise a militia to counter incidents of violence at the mountainous edges of the colony. So Logan, who still retained strong memories of the fighting spirit of the Presbyterian Ulster Scots, worked to encourage their migration to settlements he would create along the mountains west of Philadelphia, there to serve as a buffer between Native Americans and the already settled Pennsylvanians. Jim Webb put forth the thesis in his book, Born Fighting, which I recommended to you 2 weeks ago. He puts forth the thesis that the character traits he ascribes to the Scots, including loyalty to kin, extreme mistrust of governmental authority and legal structures, and a propensity to bear arms and to use them. The Scots-Irish were, as they always had been and always would be, farmers and fighters. Logan wrote, "I therefore thought it might be prudent to plant a settlement of such men as those who formerly had so bravely defended Ulster as a frontier." As wave after wave of Scots-Irish settlers came to Pennsylvania, land became scarce and prices began to rise. From where they were first settled by Logan on the frontier in Lancaster County, as the land there filled up, the Scots-Irish pressed westward across the Pennsylvania mountains and were among the first and most prominent settlers of Pittsburgh. For the entire 58 years of the Great Migration, the large majority of Scots-Irish, as they poured in through Philadelphia, kept on moving west on the path to the frontier. Their path led westward for about 100 miles or more, and then when high mountains blocked further easy movement in that direction, they turned southwestward into the Shenandoah Valley. Past the Shenandoah Valley, the waves of migration split. Some headed further southwest down what was called the Wilderness Road, which was really just a series of narrow and muddy paths leading into the gaps and hollows of the difficult mountains and fast-rushing streams where modern Tennessee meets southwestern tip of Virginia. Others pushed directly south, keeping to tamer trails and gentler ridges, along what came to be known as the Great Wagon Trail, ending up in the Carolinas. From start to finish, this highway of mostly Scots-Irish migration stretched nearly 700 miles. The western backcountry areas where these paths led were rough, dangerous places. Life was tremendously hard, an unrelenting battle to carve out settlements from the forests and to beat back the indigenous peoples who fought to retain their lands. For of course the wilderness wasn't empty. Native peoples thrived there, with a fierce love for their homeland every bit as potent as the land lust that drove the Scots-Irish interlopers. Whole families walked hundreds of miles, some of them using cows as pack animals. Few families wandered alone into the emptiness of the frontier. With the strong Scots-Irish feeling of kinship, from the very beginning, groups of families, or those who had known one another in Ireland, or been part of the same congregation in Ulster, they chose to travel west together, pooling their energies, creating a series of log cabin settlements. Trees were cleared, cabins were built, subsistence crops were planted. These were uncommonly tough people, used to hardship. Scots-Irish settlers would often squat on a piece of land and never claim it or pay for it. They maintained livestock, supplemented by crops, using simple tools and an almost wasteful land management policy, farming a field until it was barren, and then moving on. This led to them being very mobile. Migration was starting to be a hallmark of Scots-Irish culture now. It is said that no Scots-Irish family felt comfortable until it had moved at least twice. Popular histories of the Scots-Irish on the first frontier picture them as prototypical backwoodsmen. Think of Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett. Some historians suggest that they were archetypal Americans, in the sense that their ideals and attitudes, limitations and prepossessions, virtues and vices, proved to be common national characteristics of 19th century Americans. They built log cabins, farmed and traded, wove flax into linen, distilled whiskey, and fought Native Americans. These were not tartan and bagpipe Scots. These were Bible and musket Scots. Frontier Presbyterians. The Scots-Irish would head into the mountains with few texts other than the Bible in their canvas sacks. The world they would inherit was harsh and unforgiving. Where these families stopped, they were joined by others to plant settlements, staying together for mutual aid and defense. Hardscrabble communities grew up all along the trails, usually with a church meeting house as a focal point, thus creating Presbyterian congregations in the wilderness. Ministers were schoolmasters as well as preachers. Curricula in Scots-Irish log schools on the frontier resembled those of the town schools in earlier New England, with training in the 3 R's, the Bible, and the catechisms. But there were never enough ministers. The Presbyterian Church, you will remember from last week, required an educated clergy and relied on an organized structure connected through presbyteries and synods. This simply could not work on the frontier. Many congregations had to wait years for a pastor to be found, if ever. They were sheep without shepherds, and many strayed. As an Anglican minister set on a mission to the backwoods in the 1760s, wrote that he was little impressed with the quality of the parishioners of the Scots-Irish Presbyterian churches, disliking the fact that many of them drank in church and calling them, I quote, ignorant, mean, worthless, beggarly Irish Presbyterians, the scum of the earth and the refuse of mankind. In certain ways, the Presbyterian Church of the Scots-Irish was the first important denomination to become Americanized. In log churches on a frontier with a congregation of pioneer farmers, many formal traditions of the dignified Presbyterian Church of the Scots quickly vanished. The Geneva gown and stock, the high pulpit, the attendance of the minister by a verger, the set order of worship, they were all gone. Many of the colonial Presbyterian ministers to the frontier experimented with unconventional, direct methods of evangelism in order to speak clearly to a people losing interest in dignity for the sake of tradition. It's clear why the Great Awakening was particularly vital to the faith of many on the frontier. In the absence of Presbyterian ministers, for as I said a few moments ago, there were never enough ministers, quite a few of the congregations turned to the dynamic Methodists and Baptists, who drew thousands of adherents among the Scots-Irish. I remember hearing an old story when I first became a country pastor on what was the first frontier in upstate New York back in the 1770s. The story went that when the presbytery wanted to send a minister to a church on the frontier, what they did was to put a copy of the Westminster Confession in his hands, put him on a ship, and send him to Scotland for 3 years of theological education. When the Baptists wanted to send a minister to the congregations of the frontier, what they would do was put a Bible in his hands, put him on a horse, and send him west. This challenge would become even more acute in the early days of the next century, the time of the Second Great Awakening. But first, the faith of many Americans for a generation would take a back seat to politics. This was the time of our war for independence, the American Revolution. When the Revolutionary War came, Scots-Irish were the most wholehearted supporters of the American cause in each of the 13 colonies. 12 of 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Presbyterian. Others supported the war effort as chaplains and soldiers and from their pulpits and pews. American colonial ministers who supported the Revolutionary War were often called the Black Regiment because of their black robes. Their pro-revolutionary sermons and preaching were a powerful influence and moral support for American colonists prior to and during the Revolutionary War. Horace Walpole spoke from the English House of Commons to report on these extraordinary proceedings in the colonies of the New World. "There is no good crying about the matter," he said. "Cousin America has been run off with the Presbyterian parson, and that's the end of it." The parson of whom he spoke was John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian minister as well as a descendant of John Knox. At the time, Witherspoon was president of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton. He was also the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. Not all Presbyterians were patriots, nor were all patriots men. Presbyterian women gathered together into many communities, supporting the rebel cause by boycotting the importation and use of British goods. In reaction, their efforts were satirized by British cartoonist Philip Daw in his depiction of a group of North Carolina women drafting a petition to boycott English tea in response to the Continental Congress's resolution to boycott British goods. The nastiness of his cartoon shows how much these women's efforts were hurting the British. Women took on many roles in the Revolutionary War. Some of these roles were traditional, while others were unconventional and even scandalous for the time. Women did more than their share to help win America's independence. It is our shame that so many of their names have been forgotten. Let me remind you of just a few of the women patriots of the War for Independence. Deborah Sampson, colonial soldier. She invented the man's name Robert Shirtleaf when she enrolled in her 20s in the Colonial Army and enlisted in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. She served 3 years of battle without detection. She was one of only 2 women who were awarded an Army pension after the war, with thanks of a grateful nation. Lydia Darrah, undercover patriot. George Washington maintained a large spy network, including a number of agents in British-occupied Philadelphia. One of these was Lydia Darrah, a Quaker woman whose home became a meeting place for British officers. It is said that she often hid in a closet in an adjoining room when officers met, then smuggled word of their plans to her son who served in the Revolutionary forces. Her spying career saved the lives of very many Revolutionary soldiers, including, it is said, of General George Washington himself. Patience Lovell Wright, sculptor and spy. When her husband died in 1769, she began sculpting in wax to support herself. She and her sister opened waxworks museums in Manhattan and Philadelphia, but Wright wanted more. After becoming friends with the sister of Benjamin Franklin, she was encouraged to travel to London, where she quickly won over British high society, even meeting the King and Queen. But Wright was also a spy. She began gathering sensitive information during her London sculpting sessions and sent it back to Patriot leaders in the colonies, encased in her wax sculptures. Esther de Bert Reed, Homefront heroine. She was active in politics and society in Philadelphia. When Reed learned that the soldiers in the Continental Army were hungry and in need of good warm clothing, she decided she would help. She gathered other political women, and they went door to door in Philadelphia asking for donations. They collected $300,000. At Washington's urging, they spent the donations on providing clothing for the Army. She was also the author of an anonymously published broadsheet entitled Sentiments of an American Woman, which encouraged politically minded women to show their patriotism by offering material support to American soldiers, and inspired movements similar to the one in Philadelphia throughout the colonies, where women gathered money and gathered to sew clothing for the Army. Agent 355. Agent 355 is one of the most mysterious figures in the American Revolution. After more than 200 years, her identity is still unknown. A member of the Culper spy ring, she helped to uncover American General Benedict Arnold's plans to betray the revolution. She was later captured and held on a British prison ship, where she died. Margaret Corbin. During the Revolution, many women followed along behind the armies on both sides. Margaret Corbin was one of them. Corbin's husband handled ammunition for a cannon, and she assisted him. When the fort was attacked by British troops, the man operating the cannon was killed, and Corbin's husband quietly took his place, with Corbin taking over the ammunition duties. Then Corbin's husband was struck down by enemy fire and killed too. Without a pause, Corbin manned the cannon, firing it until she was struck by grape shot that seriously wounded her. In 1779, Pennsylvania awarded Corbin a $30 stipend in exchange for her service. They also recommended that she be given a soldier's pension, and the board complied. There are so many more women whose stories could be told like these. Among them, Mary Waters, Mary Priestley, Hannah Blair, Martha Custis Washington, Lucy Knox, Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, Catherine Moore Barry, Sybil Luddington, and Nancy Hart, and so many more whose names are unknown. We don't know if any of them were Presbyterians, but I have the firm conviction that any number of them were. On May 17, 1775, 1 month after Lexington and Concord, the Synod of New York and Philadelphia met in that latter city, in which the Second Continental Congress was also meeting. Only 24 ministers and 5 elders were present. The Synod declared a solemn day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer for all its congregations, and drafted a pastoral letter giving strong support to the Patriot side while still expressing loyalty to King George III. This was the first instance of a proclamation by a national church body on a political or social issue, and it was considered quite radical at the time. John Witherspoon, 1723 to 1794, was the most important Presbyterian clergyman of the Revolutionary period. He represented New Jersey in the Continental Congress from 1776 to 1782, in which capacity he signed the Declaration of Independence. On the May 17th day of prayer and fasting, Witherspoon preached at Princeton. After remarking that he had never discussed politics from the pulpit, he declared that the cause in which America is now in arms is the cause of justice, of liberty, and of human nature. That person is the best friend of American liberty, who is most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion. Whoever is an avowed enemy to God, I scruple not to call him an enemy to his country. Indeed, the cause is sacred, and the champions for it ought to be holy. For in times of trial, it is in the man of piety and inward principle that we may expect to find the uncorrupted patriot, the useful citizen, and the invincible soldier. Following the Declaration of Independence, Presbyterians were almost entirely on the side of liberty from Great Britain, holding that King George III had by his tyranny broken the social compact between himself and his American subjects, and therefore they were released from any allegiance to the crown. One historian noted that many Presbyterian pastors led the revolution from the pulpit. British historian George Trevelyan stated that political agitation against the royal government had been deliberately planned by the Presbyterians. Further, he said the revolution was fostered and abetted by Presbyterians in every colony. A Hessian captain fighting with the British agreed. In 1778, he told a friend, "Call this war by whatsoever name you may, only call it not an American Revolution. It is nothing more nor less than an Irish-Scots Presbyterian rebellion." As a result, many Presbyterians believed that the British were singling them out for special punishment, as both their institutions and ministers frequently found themselves targeted. For example, following the Battle of Long Island at the end of August 1776, the minister of the Presbyterian Church there, Ebenezer Prime, fled for safety. Although Prime escaped capture, his church did not. The British destroyed the minister's library, and they repurposed the sanctuary as a depot and barracks. The Redcoats leveled the church cemetery to create a common, and the gravestones were used to construct the troops' ovens. At the meeting of the 1777 Synod, the New Brunswick Presbytery told how the Reverend Mr. John Rossborough was barbarously murdered by the enemy at Trenton on January 2nd. According to the story recorded in a news sheet at the time, Rossborough was captured by Hessians while he was looking for his horse. Once it was discovered that he was a Presbyterian minister, he was slashed and stabbed repeatedly and left to die. Other Presbyterian chaplains and officers gave their lives to the Patriot effort. Reverend James Caldwell, 1734 to 1781, pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, earned the moniker the Fighting Parson for his commitment to the rebel cause. During the Battle of Springfield, New Jersey, the colonists were getting pushed back. The battle was not going their way. And then they ran out of wadding paper for their gunpowder. Without wadding paper, they couldn't shoot. Disaster loomed. Caldwell sprang into action. He raced on horseback to the church. There he grabbed a stack of hymn books by Isaac Watts. Racing back, he tossed hymn books to the soldiers. "Give 'em Watts, boys!" he roared as they ripped out the pages. "Put Watts into 'em!" With Watts' hymns, the Redcoats were beaten back. The Battle of Springfield was won on June 23, 1780. A year later, Caldwell was killed in battle. While what the Presbyterians suffered, both real and perceived, by hands of the British Army, only confirmed their need to separate from and resist the empire, they saw something else in their suffering as well. In a sermon defending America's struggle for independence in 1776, Jacob Green, pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Hanover, New Jersey, asked, "Though our contention with Great Britain is so glorious, yet we have reason to be humbled and abased before God for the many sins, the many vices that prevail among us. Can it be believed that a people contending for liberty should at the same time be promoting and supporting slavery?" This inconsistency, he concluded, was a crying sin in our land. Heeding many calls for repentance and renewal within the church, the 1777 Synod pleaded with their congregations to spend the last Thursday of every month in fasting and prayer to God, so that he would be pleased to pour out his Spirit on the inhabitants of our land and prepare us for deliverance from the chastenings he hath righteously inflicted upon us for our sins. Perhaps the most significant and long-lasting action of the Presbyterian Church during the war took place when the Synod of 1783 took a formal Presbyterian position for religious freedom. They wrote, "That they ever have and still do renounce and abhor the principles of intolerance, and believe that every peaceable member of civil society ought to be protected in the full and free exercise of their religion." In other words, they were publicly supporting religious freedom in the new American nation being born. Independence meant that the process of rebuilding lay ahead. Their future, as they had told themselves countless times during the war, depended on whether Americans held true to their Christian calling. After the Revolution. During the turbulent revolutionary era, the church experienced a period of distraction, disruption, and decline. The revolutionary era was a period of decline for American Christianity as a whole, not just for Presbyterians. The church in America reached a lower ebb of vitality during the 2 decades after the end of the Revolution than of any other time in its history. In many ways, the war itself began the process of decline, encouraging the flight of partisan ministers when opposing armies approached, drawing many ministers into the chaplaincy, or leading some into actual combat. The more generalized disruption and occasional devastation wrought by the war left the church disorganized and their members preoccupied by burning questions of a military and political nature. The period after the war was a critical period from the churches. They faced so many difficulties, which were the product of distraction and apathy. For 40 years, they were chiefly occupied with concerns of politics, and by the end of the period, church membership had dropped abysmally, so that not more than 1 person in 20, or possibly 1 in 10, seems to have been affiliated. Religious enthusiasm was widely spurned. Revivalism came to a temporary halt, except in the remote parts of the Deep South. Rationalism and deism of the Enlightenment spread throughout the new nation. A general assembly for a new nation. Presbyterians discovered that their pre-war Synod of New York and Philadelphia was inadequate to face the new situation. Some began to believe that the Presbyterian Church needed to be organized on a national basis to face the challenges and possibilities of a new, ever-expanding nation. The feeling was not unanimous. Finally, in 1785, the Church attacked the problem in typical Presbyterian fashion by once again appointing a committee. With John Witherspoon as chair, the committee was to draw up a manual of discipline. Instead, the committee came back with nothing less than a proposal to reorganize the whole church. In 1787, a fierce debate raged over the committee's draft of a plan of government and discipline. The century-long tension between the Scottish and New England factions, the old side and the new side, again reared its ugly head. There was nevertheless some progress, and in 1788 the Synod met in Second Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia to approve a plan of government and discipline, a directory of public worship, and a slightly revised version of the Westminster Confession of Faith. This new constitution provided for a General Assembly, which would meet annually. The General Assembly would consist of 4 synods, New York and New Jersey, Philadelphia, Virginia, and the Carolinas, with 16 presbyteries. Most important, each presbytery retained full powers of ordination. The Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, when it was founded, had 420 congregations, 214 of which had pastors, and only 177 ministers. Under this new constitution, the church settled down to orderly democratic procedures, and the overall result was distinctly American. In 1789, the General Assembly held its first meeting in Philadelphia. John Witherspoon was its first moderator. Unresolved issues. There is an old saying that if you put 5 Presbyterians together in a room, you will have 6 different opinions about everything. So it is no surprise that many issues remained unresolved to divide the church in the new nation. But that is the topic, hopefully, for some future class. As we conclude these 3 weeks, let me just quickly list a few of the unresolved issues that still existed at the end of the 18th century. First among them, slavery. In the war's aftermath, the fate of slavery remained an open question. From the 18th century to the Civil War, American Presbyterianism encompassed a wide range of viewpoints on slavery. Prominent leaders in the church were slaveholders, moderate anti-slavery advocates, and strong abolitionists. To its credit, in 1787, an overture came before the Synod of New York and Philadelphia, calling on all pastors, churches, and families under their care to do everything in their power consistent with the rights of civil society to promote the abolition of slavery. To their shame, 2 days later, delegates approved a watered-down version of the overture, praising the general principles in favor of universal liberty that prevail in America, but noting that newly freed slaves might be dangerous to the community, and endorsing a plan to give those persons who are at present held in servitude such good education as to prepare them for the better enjoyment of freedom. They further recommended to all their people to use the most prudent measures to procure eventually the final abolition of slavery in America. African American Presbyterians began organizing their own congregations in the early part of the 19th century. First African American Church in Philadelphia was founded in 1807. It was organized by John Gloucester, a former slave from Tennessee who became a Presbyterian minister. The final abolition of slavery across the United States would not come for another 78 years. In that time, the church would again be torn apart, old school, new school, and north-south. Other issues divided Presbyterians. The old issue of subscription raised its ugly head again as the nation and the churches were wrestling with the ideas of the Enlightenment. The Second Great Awakening again raised the issue of how Presbyterians would reach those living on the new frontier to the west of the Appalachians. In the Revolutionary era, the church had been deeply involved in the politics of the day. Now there would be debate about whether the church in the new nation should continue to be involved in politics at all, or limit itself to strictly spiritual matters. These and other issues would so divide the church in the first third of that century that by 1837 an article in a Philadelphia news sheet claimed that schism in the Presbyterian Church was inevitable. The author wrote, "The necessity for separation of the parties is urgent. They do not agree. They cannot agree. We can scarcely conceive of two parties more antagonistic in all the principles of their belief and practice. They receive not the same gospel. They adopt not the same moral code." This family tree we looked at last week tells the story of the Presbyterian Church for the next 200 years, being one of division and uniting. But as I said, that is a story for another time. Thank you for sharing with me these 3 weeks when we talked about how Presbyterians came to America. Thank you.